Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in 1 minute.
Bonjour, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to our roundtable. This roundtable is dedicated to the Lion of Cameroon, my late brother, the saxophone legend and international symbol of African music, Manu Dibango. The New York Forum Institute was created 10 years ago to address crisis through new business models and innovative solutions. In these challenging times, it is important for me personally to go back to my roots in Africa, where I'm very pleased to welcome today more than 3,000 participants from 120 plus countries. Half of them are in Africa. I hope you are safe. I hope your family are doing well. And thank you for being with us today. I would like to thank our partner, Africa 24, Africa 24, for being with us and for replaying our session later today. We have few rules of engagement, which I would like to share with you. Your participation is absolutely important and crucial during this event. We want this event to be very interactive. We want to be hearing from you as well as our very prestigious speakers. We will feature some of the questions we receive from you, and you will also have the opportunity to vote on polling question. Let's have the first polling, by the way. The first polling question is about what is today the most critical risk that Africa is facing due to the coronavirus pandemic. So economic recession in your perspective, lack of access to education, food crisis, collapse of health systems, breakdown in regional integration, or undetected spread of the disease.
I will also speak in French in order to invite our French-speaking participants to vote and to give us their feelings in terms of what they believe to be the most important risks that Africa is faced with. And as soon as everyone will have voted, we will discover the results together. So, as you can see, without a doubt, it is the economic aspects that are the main concern that are ahead. And this is a topic that we will raise and discuss together. So, without further ado, we will discuss Africa, its resiliency, and I am giving the floor immediately to our first moderator and friend, Dr. Vera Songwe, who is Under Secretary General at the United Nations and Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa and her panel.
The floor is yours.
Merci, Richard.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. It's a pleasure to see you and to be with you today for this panel. And so I've just realized that since I'm speaking right after you, I'm speaking in French. So first, I will greet my guests before switching languages. We have here with us today Mr. Tidjane Thiam, who needs no introduction. We also have with us Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. They are, who needs no introduction either. They are two of the special envoys of the African Union, as well as another famous businessman from our continent, Tony Elumelu. This afternoon, or today rather, we will discuss Resilient Africa, and we have seen how resilient Africa has been since January, when we were first affected by the pandemic. So I would like to ask a few questions of my guests in order to know how they live this experience in Africa, how they have perceived the response from Africa, and how these 3 months have affected them. And I will ask the first question to Dr. Ngozi Okonjo.
So I'm coming to you for the first question. We're talking about resilient Africa and how Africans are witnessing and living the COVID pandemic. Of course, we've seen data from the World Bank and the IMF that shows that growth is going to be severely compromised. The Economic Commission for Africa itself has done some analysis that shows that we will go from 3.2% growth to 1.8 in the best of cases, and maybe 0% growth. What do you think Africa is doing to be more resilient, and how do you see the crisis unfolding? I'll come back to you for what else the international community can do for this.
Well, thank you, Vera, for that. I must say that the narrative of the continent was, somewhat positive before the pandemic hit. If you recall, the IMF had projected a growth rate for 2020 for the continent of about 3.6%, compared to global growth of about 3.3%. So a relatively robust growth story or narrative. And then the pandemic hit. This pandemic has been a huge exogenous shock, a shock on both the supply and demand side that has resulted in the prices of our products that we export falling precipitously. At the same time, we've had difficulties with the prices of exports. We've had the prices of the products we import increase. Remittances have dried up on the continent, tourism, our currencies have depreciated, and there's been capital flight out of the continent. So all these things have happened with an event that has been external to us. And I think that the continent has really been acted, our leaders have acted responsibly and with a great sense of purpose and unity. And I think this has helped us to a tremendous extent, including also resilience that has come from the experiences we've had in the past with other infectious diseases like Ebola, where we've been able to develop systems for contact tracing and follow up with people. So that has been a hallmark. But coming back to the actions of our leaders, they've implemented lockdowns, which have been very difficult, social distancing. You know that 70% or more of our people work in the informal sector. So implementing a lockdown is courageous politically, means that people cannot go out and earn on a daily basis. In spite of all of this, our leaders have also implemented some economic measures. They've tried to do fiscal stimulus of about 0.8% of GDP. It's a fraction of what is being done in the rich countries, which is about 8 to 10%. They've suspended taxes and tariffs. The central banks have provided some liquidity to our businesses and SMEs. But this is not enough, given the extent of the shock we've suffered. Obviously, we need to go out to get more support in order for us to weather this shock. Let me finally say that on this segment, that the unity of purpose of the continent has been evident. The African Union has come together, deciding to procure equipment together. They've appointed the 5 envoys to help look for external resources together. There's a great recognition that the only way we are going to fight this pandemic is through unity of purpose and unity of action. So this has been very pleasing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ngozi, for that very comprehensive answer, which shows, I think, how resilient and how responsive the African governments have been. Tijan, I'm coming to you. We've seen, and I know President Ouattara is with us here today, in a country like Ivory Coast, something about $1.2 billion have been put to fight COVID. In Senegal, something in the same amounts. In Ghana, $700 million. A lot of our countries, heads of states, have released stimulus packages to support domestic business. But we know, as Ngozi said, that those stimulus packages will not be enough. Countries and leaders have shown resilience by deciding and allowing the private sector, and Tony is listening to this, not to pay taxes for 3 months. They have talked about standstills. When the ministers of finance met at the Economic Commission for Africa sometime at the end of March, they called for a global debt standstill for Africa. What is your sense of this? You have been a proponent and an advocate of this. Where are we with this conversation?
That's right, Vera. Good morning. I'd like to say hello to Ngozi and to Tony. Pleasure to be on this panel with them. And take 10 seconds to pay tribute to my friend Richard Atias. I've known Richard since '95, and an event like this is a realization of a vision he had for Africa. The fact that we can talk across continents with thousands of participants. So coming to your question, I think Ngozi did a very good job presenting the current challenge in Africa, the drop in revenue. If you think about it in simple terms, the capital inflows have been going down. Tourism, export, remittances, commodity prices, plus the capital flight, and the capital outflows from Africa, which mainly concerned with debt, have remained. So that has created a very high degree of pressure on the African economies, and we have a situation of quasi-negative net flows, as we say, where basically there is more capital coming out of Africa than coming into Africa, which is really an aberration. And that's really what drove the push for a debt standstill, to pass this very challenging situation and to make sure that what has started as a liquidity event doesn't become a solvency crisis. So the G20, as you know, Vera, and you were instrumental in that, has taken a number of steps to allow African countries to benefit from a standstill. But beyond that, we're also working as envoys and you and Ngozi to also deal with the issue of the commercial debt. Because as Africa made the progress that Ngozi described, actually a number of countries have become creditworthy and have rightly tapped the international capital markets, but confronted with a shock of this magnitude, there is a need to change the profile of that debt and improve its terms, probably with blended finance instruments, with a degree of concessionality and help from the international community. So we are working on those concepts, and I'm quite optimistic that we'll get to something. But I just want to reiterate the extreme uncertainty we are facing. This crisis is only starting, and we have to make sure that we don't end up with a combination of the Spanish flu and the 1929-1930 depression, which would be an unprecedented event in world history. We're looking at drops in GDP. We're looking at increases in unemployment in developed economies, which will have a very severe impact on Africa. And we need to be proactive and anticipate and take measures to make sure that our populations who actually need investment in health, in education, in infrastructure, are very young and dynamic, can continue to see an improvement in their living conditions, which is what we have seen in the last 20 years in Africa, across Africa.
Thank you very much, TJ. And I think you make a very important point here. Over the last 2 decades, let me say, Africa has really changed from a country where 75% of the countries on the continent were low-income countries to a continent today where over 75% of those countries are either beginning to become low middle-income countries or middle-income countries. A lot of those countries are now also accessing capital markets and would like to maintain their access to capital markets. So we hope that, I think as every country has reiterated, there are not going to be defaults on the continent, and we hope that we can continue to work with the private sector and our creditors to ensure that there is some resolution to our problem. I think when anybody who has visited Lagos knows about the Hilton Hotel in Lagos, the ECA just did some work that showed that one of the big sectors of the economies of Africa that are suffering from this crisis is the hospitality sector. Of course, with the tourism sector, which is particularly hitting women as well. Tony, you're not a woman, but you're going to talk about it. You have been a champion of youth employment and ensuring that women have access to business. But because of the tourism hit that is happening today on the continent, what do you see as a response that we can give to ensure that we can build back better, that we can come back? You are the demonstration of resilience in Nigeria. You've been able to provide energy, renewable energy on the continent. What is the private sector of the continent, as resilient as you are? What do you need to ensure that when we start to build back better, we can actually lift the youth with us and the women?
Vera, thanks so much. And let me say well done to my dear friend, Richard, for making this possible. He keeps trying to throw the light on Africa, because one of the things we need is we need the world to know what's happening on our continent. I'd like to start by saying, Vera, that it goes beyond hospitality sector. It goes beyond some of the issues that you've talked about. This pandemic is a very serious one. And indeed, I would say that without it, the African economic space was already in some form of dire straits. And I tell you from where I sit, my primary, one of the hats I wear is the hat of the group chairman for United Bank for Africa PLC that operates in 20 African countries and some other jurisdictions outside. Is that first, those who 10% or about less than 10% of our customers account have over $1,000 balances in their accounts. And these 10% account for over 75% of our clientele, of our total deposit in all of these 20 countries that we're operating across Africa, with over 20 million customers. We have seen significant and unacceptable unemployment rate in Africa. We have also seen endemic poverty. We talked today about some palliatives and some form of debt relief for Africa. But if we recall my big sister there, Ngozi, She was finance minister in Nigeria at this point, and she, President Obasanjo, they worked very hard for debt cancellation on Nigeria. Today, we're talking about debt relief, debt standstill for Africa. You know, for me, this is the kind of circularity that we should not allow to continue. So it goes beyond just one sector of the African economy. There's something that's not right. Disruption has come to stay. 2020 started with disruptions. And it just, in my viewpoint, it began. We will continue to have economic disruption, digital health, pandemic health disruption we'll have security disruption. And the point for every one of us is how do we reset Africa so that when these disruptions come, because they will definitely come, we also have digital and technological disruptions. When they come, how are we able to withstand this? How do we ensure that we are not going to go again begging for debt relief for Africa? It's becoming, in my viewpoint, the secularity is becoming embarrassing to all of us. So we need to reset. We need to look at issues much more fundamental. We need to look at why are we where we are and what must we do to address this. So, and I must commend and congratulate my friend Tijan and my big sister Ngozi for the great job they are doing as our envoys. In my viewpoint, as we engage with the rest of the world in providing relief, we'll call it, because it is relief, palliative. That is what it is, not a permanent solution to our issues. We need to look at it from a much more fundamental perspective. What must we do as a continent to ensure that when these disruptions come next, will be security disruption or technological digital disruption or economic disruption that will inevitably come, we are able to withstand this. I have often argued that we need a form of Marshall Plan. I came to the 1940 Marshall Plan that was put in place. We need to mobilize everyone so that Africa can come together. So that it's not just about the tourism sector, about one other sector. All of us can address this issue. Speaking specifically about the employment issue, I think if we look at the youth issue, if we have a Marshall Plan that mobilizes resources to address some critical sector like access to electricity, which is a major issue on the continent, then we'll begin the conversation. We'll begin to make sure that we don't go again begging for people to bail us out, because we must, as a continent, accept the fact that disruption has come to stay. If before maybe 3, 4, 5 years, and that won't happen. And so a solution to us should be much more than a sectoral, one sector approach. I think, do we have the resources and capability for this to happen? Yes. If you look at Ngozi, if you look at Tijan, these are great Africans, and they can mobilize people, and both within and outside Africa, the private sector, the public sector. In my little world, as the founder of the Tony Elumelu Foundation, we experimented something. We endowed $100 million to support young African entrepreneurs, young Africans who have economic ambitions. We believe that what we need is economic opportunity. And what we have done so far shows to us clearly that we can fix access to electricity on the continent, if we can ensure, like what Ngozi led for a long time when she was in Nigeria, for instance, stability of macroeconomic policy and environment. If we can prioritize the youth, to a large extent, we're able to fix some of these issues, because ultimately, unemployment level in Africa is unacceptable. Poverty level is totally endemic and cripple us. And these are things that predispose Africa to extremism. We must, and youth migration, we must fix them. To me, I see this pandemic as an opportunity to reset Africa. The easiest thing for us to do, the easiest escape for us is to just say, take more debts, give us a moratorium, or no interest repayment, and it keeps going on. And that circularity is an issue we must deal with. And to deal with it, we need to prioritize our young ones. We need to get our government to ensure stable macroeconomic policy. Some are doing very well in that area, but we need to bring everyone to the table. Let all of us see how we can deal with the issue of unemployment in a sustainable fashion. And to me, that is by empowering the small and medium-scale enterprises, the young Africans who have economic ambition, who are energetic, who work very hard, who want to succeed, and who have been succeeding from what we see.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you so much for that. I think that if I may be provocative, Africa has already launched its own plan. It's called the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. I think that if we are looking for a plan to reset and to recharge Africa, that is the plan. And as you said, you're in 21 countries on the continent. My sense is, can Africa use the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement? In the spirit of this conversation of resilient Africa, we have seen young scientists in Senegal doing test kits. We have seen people in South Africa doing ventilators, and across the continent, young women doing masks. So if ever there was a question about whether Africa was resilient, I think we have the answer. The question now is, what else do we need as enabling factors to make sure that we get there? You mentioned the capital markets and the issue of debt. Africa is going to need robust capital markets to continue growing. I don't know, I'm going to throw this question to you, Tijan. You're coming from the world's apex of capital market development. No continent has developed without capital markets. What do you think we should do? People talk about local currency. A little bit of our debt problem is because we're borrowing in foreign currency. What can Africa do to indigenize its growth?
Yeah. No, thank you very much. I'll try to not be too long, but I want to very, very violently agree with Tony. I think what he said is absolutely key. One word we don't say enough is entrepreneurs. I mean, you know, I've spent a lot of my career dealing with Asia, working with Asia for more than 20 years. The single unique characteristic is how many Tony Elomulus there are in Asia. If you look at the numbers, about 65% of the wealth created in Asia is created by first or second generation entrepreneurs. 65%. If you look at Europe, for instance, 65% of the wealth is owned by fifth or sixth generation people, i.e. it's the grandfather's grandfather who made them. And that dynamism that we've seen in Asia, particularly in China, is something that is at the heart of the wealth creation process. And a lot of what the countries need to do is to promote a class of entrepreneurs, because you can then drive forward the economy and generate the resources that would lead to employment. And we know what needs to be done, because it's been done in many places to get there. But that has to be an explicit objective of the policy. Now, as far as capital markets are concerned, the reality is we're going to need an external inflow of capital for a long time. We're going to need the government and the multilateral institutions to crowd in private capital because there is a huge need for investment. Tony mentioned energy, for instance, which is at the start of all development. I mean, if you take Côte d'Ivoire, we built independent, privately financed power plants back in the 90s, and that has played a big role in the current economic growth. So investment in infrastructure, investment in education, investment in health, all that has a relatively long paybacks, and we're going to need that infusion of capital. And I agree with Tony too. We must get out of this cycle of constant restructuring, even on a personal basis. If you lend money to a friend and every now and then he comes back and says, okay, why don't you forget about my debt? That's not going to work. Okay? So this pattern where we have to keep coming back, asking for reschedulings, relief, cancellations, has to be broken. And a big part of the answer is to really mobilize enough resources. And the African ministers have asked for $200 billion. If you look, just yesterday, Europe announced a $500 billion plan. We talk about $200 billion for a continent of 1.3 billion people. It's in the interest of the world economy to promote that growth in Africa and fund it, because the alternative scenario is unmanageable and will be a lose-lose for Africa.
Thank you so much. Ngozi, I'm coming to you. You have worked with the Nick Stern Commission on the Build Back Better sustainable development, looking into the future. And also, I have two questions for you. I've really been asked them quickly. The vaccines. How do we build back better? We know that Africa needs to diversify. What are the two messages that you have for Africa in the Build Back Better side? And I think a question that everybody is asking across the world, and you are now an envoy also to WHO, is Africa going to be first in line to get the vaccine as well?
Well, that's Vera, thank you. Those are a lot of questions to tackle, but I want to come back to the excellent points made by my brother Tony and brothers Tony and Tijan, and build a little bit on that, on your Build Back Better question. The first thing I would like to say is that, as Tony mentioned, we can see this pandemic and this crisis as an opportunity for the continent. When we look at what has happened with some supply chains, for example, we saw that the whole world was scrambling with respect to getting all the test kits, the masks, the equipment needed, because most of the supply chains were outside of the continent. You mentioned the free trade agreement, Continental Free Trade Agreement. Well, we have to make this real. And this means we have to rely on ourselves and have a plan where we specialize our countries in manufacturing some of the things that we need so we can trade with other countries. Take pharmaceuticals, for instance. Your ECA has done work that shows that we import almost 94% of the pharmaceuticals we need on the continent. As we look at how we make opportunity out of this crisis, we should look at why don't we specialize in producing some of these pharmaceuticals. Some countries can take this up on the continent. Some are already doing it in Nigeria, South Africa. We're doing some of this. More of that could happen. Other areas where we could have a comparative advantage to produce good jobs for our young people. I totally agree that the focus should be on our young people, both producing good jobs in big enterprises, but also supporting them as entrepreneurs, particularly our women as well. As we build back better, we must also put women and youth at the center. We have to listen to what they have to say with respect to the future and involve them in the decision making. So I'd really like to stress that point. Jobs, jobs, jobs. What are we going to do to diversify our base on the continent so we can create the jobs we need? We are going to have the largest number of youth in the world by 2050. We have to think forward. Now, moving quickly to your question on vaccines. Well, you can see that there's a race on to be able to find the vaccines that would be a sustainable solution to the health crisis we're in. What has been very interesting in this crisis is the vulnerability of all systems all over the world. The rich countries that had strong health systems were overwhelmed, let alone ourselves. So looking to the future, sustainable solutions is what everybody's scrambling for. And we hope that those who are working on vaccines, that some of our African scientists can also be engaged. Our Africa CDC has done a wonderful job so far, even the CDCs in individual countries, and we hope to involve them in this work as we move forward. We are looking at these vaccines. There's a global effort underway with WHO at the center, Gavi, where I'm chair of the board, the Global Vaccine Alliance, and CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. All are working with one purpose. When vaccines become available, they should be seen as a global public good, meaning that this should not be a question of profit for the companies that make it, but availability for everybody in the world at an affordable price. So that is the objective we have. In that circumstance, we are there to make sure that Africa will not be last in line, that all people, all our continent will be prioritized as well. This means we have to make large quantities and large volumes. And it is this very thing that Gavi, with the advanced market commitment, this is a financial instrument we have to assure we can manufacture enough volume for our continent. So don't worry, we will be prioritized.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think just in ending this conversation on resilient Africa, I'm sitting here in Ethiopia, in East Africa. We have had some of the largest growth rates, the largest GDP per capita increases, and the largest reductions in poverty on the continent. And I think that we want to continue to believe that we will do that and do that better. And there's no better example than Kenya and the work that they're doing on ICT to ensure that the youth have jobs. That shows us that Africa can be resilient, that the products that are coming out of Kenya in the ICT sector are being used in New York, in Asia, Tijan, as you talk about it. The M-Pesa platform, can we digitize that? Can we move that to the capital markets? I think Africa has all the tools that it needs to become even more resilient and to ensure that we don't have this circularity that Tony talked about. So we hope that as we continue this debate, our leaders will tell us what they're doing and ensure that we can all build back better and be here again talking about how we came out of this crisis on our own. Thank you very much for this conversation, and everybody stay safe. And one last thank you to all our nurses who are on the front lines of this crisis to ensure that they are also safe. Thank you very much. And merci for the
Thank you once again, Richard, for this opportunity. I thank you and I give the floor back to you.
Merci, Vera. Merci à tous.
Merci, au revoir. Bye-bye. Bye.
Merci. Stay safe.
Thank you, Vera. Thank you very much. Merci, Tijan. Thank you, Ngozi. Thank you, Tony. It was a very inspiring conversation. And at least I am taking one message. Let's try from this crisis to have more made in Africa ideas, made in Africa products, made in Africa everything. Now it's very clear that this call to action coming from key players and key actors from the private sector, from even economic experts. But now we would like also to hear from you once again, from you, the audience. So let's see our second polling questions. The second polling question is about the partnership. Which partnership Africa should continue to develop and to work with to recover? So you have several options. One option, of course, is the international multilateral institutions, UN, World Bank, IMF, the traditional partners. The second option could be the major trade partners, the countries working a lot with Africa, China, Turkey, of course, United States, the European Union, so far and so on. Africa regional institutions, African Development Bank, and the African Union, and of course the private sector. So let's vote and let's see who do you consider should be the key partners for Africa during this recovery. Quite interesting result, it's quite well balanced, and we see that international institutions as much as private sector, as much as African. So in fact, the answer and the message is very clear. Everyone has to work together. Everyone has to work together to be a true partner of Africa. Now, I would like to go very quickly to my second session, and I will give the floor to my friend Asha Leke, who is the chairman of Africa, of McKinsey Africa, with his panel. Asha, the floor is yours.
Merci, Richard. Thanks for that. Thanks for the invitation, and it's great to be here with my fellow panelists. We have heard from the previous panel all the efforts that are going in to make sure that we have the resources we need as a continent to address the crisis. What's even more important, I would argue, is to make sure those resources are well spent, that they're spent effectively and efficiently to stimulate our economies. And so to help us discuss that and understand what's happening in these countries and what they're doing to stimulate the economies, we have Her Excellency Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, who's the Minister of International Cooperation from Egypt, and His Excellency Amadou Wat, my good friend, the Minister of Economy, Planning and International Cooperation from Senegal, who's otherwise known as the hottest minister in Africa. Actually, I have to introduce him that way. So welcome, both of you.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Let me start with Your Excellency Al-Mashat. When we talk about stimulating the economy, there are usually three things in mind. One is protecting jobs. That's a big focus. We know there are about 150 million jobs from our McKinsey analysis that are at risk on the continent. Of course, most of those, 80% or more, within the SME sector. Secondly, it's on supporting vulnerable populations, right? We were very excited to be the fastest urbanizing region in the world. The reality is more than half of the people who live in urban cities in Africa live in slums. And the crisis has really highlighted the plight of our urban vulnerable. So how do we support them in a context where many of our countries didn't have social safety net programs to begin with? And thirdly is how do we sort of ensure that some key strategic sectors or strategic companies are also protected? That's really what the focus is. When we talk about Egypt, I think on the health crisis through the Africa CDC as portal, we kind of see what's going on. We know Egypt unfortunately has the second highest number of cases and I think the highest number of reported deaths. Can you tell us a bit more on the economic crisis? How badly has Egypt been affected and what is the government doing about it?
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for convening a special day on Africa. May 25th is the day for Africa. So it's good that we're doing this before. Similar to other countries, we as a government launched the recovery and rebuild strategy very early on. And it really depends on three pillars. It's protecting citizens out of COVID. It's providing the necessary liquidity for firms. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Also credit to the household so that consumption is smooth. And then third is to progress with our structural reforms during and post-COVID. The government took very decisive actions. We have a fiscal stimulus package of around $6 billion that was launched early on. This part of the resources definitely went to the most affected sectors. As you mentioned, tourism for us is very, very important. That is a sector that saw a lot of tax breaks, credit and loans at a discounted interest rate. Many of the rules or the litigation that was between the government and many of these firms was also let go. When it comes to real estate, because also construction is very important, there's a lot happening on infrastructure, housing. All of these are sectors that got special attention from the government. Also, liquidity and credit was availed through the banking sector for SMEs at very discounted rates, and there was definitely extension of payments for the loans. On the vulnerable, and I always, as was mentioned earlier, in every crisis there's an opportunity. In this case, there was some silver lining. One aspect in Africa is that there's a big informal sector. And therefore, it was very important to address informality. And there have been lots of policies put in place to formalize the informal sector. And this was really expedited during COVID. So we have more than 1 million of the informal workers registering through, of course, another very speedy way of doing financial inclusion, which was also one of the outcomes of the crisis. Social safety nets were spread out so that the beneficiaries would be more, and there was special pension also provided for several of the groups. Another vulnerable group which is affected is women, and Egypt is the first country to provide woman-specific COVID response, and we have a policy tracker which is actually looking at the different implementation of the policies put out by the government through the National Council of Women. So that is also something which was quite important and quite novel. Of course, unemployment is a big challenge. It was a challenge for the continent before COVID. Now it's even going to be more of a challenge. Nonetheless, through the fiscal stimulus that is provided, trying to stave off and mitigate some of the implications, and then through pushing forward with structural reforms that invite more of the private sector. I think these are very important measures that we are taking from our side to see through this crisis.
Thank you, Excellency. So quite a broad set of comprehensive measures touching all the different segments of those who are affected. If I turn to you, Your Excellency Hott, what about Senegal? You know, how big, you know, it's great to hear Egypt's 6%, $6 billion, so probably, you know, 5% or so of GDP as stimulus packages. On average, African countries have generally put out packages of 1 to 2%. So I'd love to understand how big Senegal's package is. And secondly, if we focus more on the SME space, so, you know, the big question is how do you really get to the SMEs? Most of them, 15% of the 80 million SMEs in Africa are not registered or are registered only 15%. So 85% are not. So I'd love to understand how you're really supporting SMEs in Senegal, in addition to how big the stimulus package is.
Thank you very much, Acha, and thanks to Richard for having us on this program. Basically, our stimulus package is roughly about 6 to 7% of GDP. And this is something that His Excellency, the President Macky Sall, has decided to provide so that we can attenuate, we can reduce the negative impact of this crisis on the entire economy, not only the private sector, but also the impact on the vulnerables, on the population, on everybody. And what we have done is then work quickly to try to mobilize the resources, and mostly so far from our development partners, including, of course, the classical multilateral development banks, but also some bilateral partners, mixing concessional loans and some grants in some cases. And it was very important for us to address the SMEs, in particular also the macro enterprises, and to also support those sectors that are mostly affected. It's basically the tourism sector, the air transport, but even also the domestic transport, land transport, because the measures that we have taken inside the country, you know, with the curfew, with the state of emergency, many transporters also were negatively impacted. On the SME side and the micro enterprises side, it's very fortunate that the government had already existing instruments that we have made stronger by providing them with resources that include a guarantee fund that the president set up early on in 2013-14, which has been doing very well, working with the informal sector, working with the micro enterprises, providing them with guarantees so that they can get funding either from banks, but more so from the microfinance institutions at a subsidized interest rate. Typically, microfinances charges around 20 to 25%, basically for loans of 1 year or 6 months. But what we end up doing is structuring something so that the rate can go down as far as 9%. And then the bigger SMEs with the turnover of, let's say, $100,000 to $200,000 to roughly $400,000, we have decided basically to provide a 200 billion CFA financing line, that is about $320 million, with the government providing partial guarantees. So very high guarantees for SMEs because they're more risky, and then lower guarantees for the big companies that really can borrow often without providing too much collateral. And we also provided the banks with deposits at zero interest rate that will allow them to get some resources, therefore at a very low cost. And we worked with the central bank, which is the BCEAO, which is our West African Monetary Union central bank, based here out of Dakar. And the central bank really responded also very rapidly by providing a COVID-19 sort of window that also has expanded the number of companies or the kind of companies that are eligible for refinancing. So therefore, the banks can lend at about 3.5% interest rate, all costs in, instead of 10-12%. And the loans will be roughly about 3 to 6 years, with a moratorium of 12 months as well, to make sure that the companies have resources to pay for their working capital, of course, including paying salaries. The government, to protect the workers, has decided to sort of issue a kind of law, an ordinance to basically ask the companies to pay 70% of the salaries, of the net salary, to workers that are partially sort of temporarily laid off. And therefore, the government needed to help the companies to provide them with the liquidity that they need to meet that requirement. Of course, for now, we are forecasting it will last about 3 months. So by end of June, early July, we'll see some recovery, but not for all the sectors. The airline industry, the hotel sector, probably not before the end of October. So we will need to provide more support to those specific sectors.
Again, another comprehensive set of support which is provided in Senegal. But we are running out of time, so Your Excellency, I'm going to speak very quickly to get your perspective. So if you start to actually reimagine coming up, what are some of the lessons, one of the key lessons we should learn as a continent coming out of this crisis?
You know, this whole concept of globalization, will it continue, will it not continue, etc. Is it good or is it bad? I think that this crisis has shown us a very decent amount of humility, that countries, regardless of how, where they are in their level of development, a pandemic comes and affects everyone. And that requires a lot of collaboration. There are common problems between countries, among different continents, but the solutions are going to be global. If we're talking about a vaccine, if we're talking about a simulation, if we're talking about opening up aviation again. So all of this requires a lot of collaboration, a lot of work together. So I believe that despite being challenged a little bit through, you know, capital increases in multilateral institutions, but nonetheless, collaboration comes to the fore. The other thing which this crisis has brought out is a lot of innovation in policy making, innovation in businesses trying to find different ways in doing their day-to-day work. It has also shown that citizens have become very innovative when it comes to you know, working, if you're a public employee working from home. Even now we're doing this forum virtually. So there has been, I think, we have been tested, we have been pushed, and this gives us a lot of faith in ourselves that reforms are possible. We can, I think someone in the previous panel used Reset Africa. We need to see how our countries in Africa can become more resilient by diversification. Also, I will conclude by saying that the supply chains globally have been you know, challenged as well, and that's why looking at regional supply chains, and I think in Africa there are plenty of complementarities that can take place so that we are protected together and collectively against future crises.
Thank you. And Minister Hart, very briefly, any final messages from you?
Very briefly, just first of all, to agree with all what Dr. Rania has said, and then to say that from the African perspective, we really need to work together, speak with one voice, in particular when it comes to, let's say, debt issues. That is why the finance ministers, economy and development ministers, we've been working very well with the Economic Commission for Africa, with Vera, but also with the special envoys, including Tidjane and also Dr. Ngozi, to make sure that we are approaching the debt issues for Africa with the same voice, in particular trying to innovate, providing or proposing to the market probably some kind of instrument that will allow the African countries to really meet their commercial debt obligations with the international markets, and at the same time also getting some fresh liquidity while improving our rating, while improving our credit worthiness, so that in the very long run, we can achieve a very low cost of funding from the international market, which we need for our development. And we've been having many conference calls, almost on a weekly basis, sometimes three times a week. And we are hoping that we'll get to a solution that is implementable as soon as possible. Time is of the essence. Thank you.
Thank you. So again, you know, a lot happening in our countries to make sure the stimulus package is well spent. And I think a big message from both of you to make sure we don't waste this crisis. So on that note, thanks everybody. And thanks again, Richard, for organizing this.
Please welcome back Richard Atias.
Merci, mon
Thank
cher
you,
Achar.
dear Asha.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Dr. Rania. Thank you, Amadou. Et maintenant,
And now, it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome the panel with our prestigious heads of states. It will be an interactive session.
Une session à laquelle nous allons avoir par ordre alphabétique
And in alphabetic order, we will have President Julius Maada,
Son Excellence le Président
His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta from Kenya,
Son Excellence
His Excellency Mahamadou Issoufou from Niger, His Excellency Alassane Ouattara from Côte d'Ivoire,
et Son Excellence
and His Excellency Macky Sall, President of Senegal.
pour accueillir maintenant
So
nos
here
panélistes.
comes the panel.
Monsieur le Président Issoufou,
President Issoufou, if you will allow me, I will begin with you. As President of ECOWAS, African countries are showing their resiliency to overcome this crisis, but they can only count on themselves, whereas the rest of the world has also been affected. But the most recent virtual summit of ECOWAS has shown that you are united. How does this change the way in which the continent is managing its current health policy? Well, I would like to thank you, Richard Atias, for having organized this panel, and I would like to greet all the heads of state who are taking part in it. It is true that the African continent is faced with this global health crisis, but for the time being, Africa has 0.42% of mortality linked to COVID in the world, whereas the population of the continent represents 17% of world population. Several factors explain the resiliency shown by Africa in this crisis. Maybe some immunity due to the fact that we have the presence of viral and infectious diseases in Africa. Others say that there are other factors at play, the climate or the youthfulness of the population, but also the fact that Africa is somewhat outside of global circuits, since we only represent 2% of global trade. Be that as it may, research and studies will try to study all of this in the future. But the measures of isolation cannot, in and of themselves, explain our resilience, since developed countries have not been spared. African countries have understood that we need to put the premium on the fight against COVID. We organized conferences of heads of states at the level of ECOWAS and African Union, and several recommendations were made, including a solidarity fund for the African Union for health, the strengthening of cooperation between the continental body on epidemics, the CDC, and the regional institutions dealing with health issues. We have also strengthened cooperation between member states in terms of research, training, and the exchange of experience in health writ large, and more specifically in terms of the fight against COVID-19. And in this fight against the pandemic, international solidarity, I do believe, more than ever becomes necessary. And issues such as access to water and basic health care should be of the utmost importance and should be considered as matters pertaining to human rights. But for the time being, Africa has shown its resiliency, this despite the fact that some of those had predicted that the continent would collapse faced with this health crisis. Thank you, President Issoufou. President Macky Sall. Good morning. Thank you for being with us. You, a few weeks ago, you were one of the first to take the floor, and you raised a very important concept that you called a new world order. Can you discuss this with us, Mr. President? Thank you, Richard, first for having organized this very important discussion, and I thank the New York Forum Institute, and I greet my colleagues who are taking part in this panel with me today. I would also like to thank the Economic Commission for Africa, which is working with our ministers, as well as the African Union, through the task force that was set up to deal with the issue of debt cancellation for Africa. And the conclusion is unanimous. This crisis, this pandemic of COVID-19 has shown that whatever the development level of countries, be they G20 countries or countries of the G7 even, African countries or developing countries, we have not found the appropriate responses. We were all caught by surprise by the scope of the pandemic. And despite the scientific progress, despite the wealth of our world, the health systems globally were not up to the task, or at the very least, were not capable of stemming the consequences of the disease. And this should lead us to think about our development models, because at the end of the day, what are we trying to do? We consider that despite the sizable financing, which is the levels of the finance, the global finance, billions of dollars a day, humanity was not capable of developing solidarity amongst countries, despite the calls and despite the behavior of Africa, and President Issoufou has just mentioned this. Without very important means, Africa was able nonetheless to show its resiliency in terms of the number of people contaminated and the mortality rate. Clearly, there are still things that we don't know about the virus. We don't fully understand the resiliency of the continent. It's clearly a combination of factors. But despite all the efforts at the outset of the G20 to go towards pardoning of bilateral debt, that was the first step, but it was insufficient. When faced with the economic and social consequences of the pandemic. And it's at this level that we continue to request more solidarity for a new world order based on human values, based on solidarity, international solidarity. And I have to say that as I'm speaking to you, I find myself a little bit saddened to note that actually the pandemic did not lead humanity to draw real lessons. Today, you have countries who are fully capable of saying, we will find $1 billion, we will find $2 billion. And just wanting to find these resources, they do. And other countries such as ours, despite our efforts, we are not able today to find $2 or $3 billion in order to face not only the health response, because we are daily in this fight, day and night, in order to contain the disease. But we are not able to ensure the protection for our businesses and to protect jobs. So there is a certain unfairness. And we see that COVID-19 is just exacerbating the unfairness, and the international system needs to change. And so I'm pleading for a global renewal based on more social fairness, because what we are still living is the consequences of an economic model stemming from World War II. And everything was built on this model, whereas from a time when Africa was not independent, today 1.3 billion Africans, what will we do when there is a vaccine? And the countries that will discover this vaccine will not accept to share this vaccine for all of us. So we are also requesting that this vaccine, whatever the country that develops this, be made available to Africa and the rest of humanity. So I want to place ourselves in terms of a new vision based on a new solidarity, new values, a new world, and we want to continue our combat, each country today, in order to stem the disease and contain it, and to avoid its mortality. Thank you, President Macky Sall. We will come back on all of these topics, which are essential, but I would now like to ask a question of President Ouattara. Your Excellency, your government announced a response plan for COVID-19. To what extent does this plan ensure the protection of the more vulnerable and contain the economic crisis that has been forecasted? Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon, all my friends, all my brothers and sisters who are with us today. I want to thank you. And I had difficulties to hear Richard before, but I'm delighted to see him, and I have heard what my brothers Issoufou and President Sall have had to say, and we fully agree. And as regarding Côte d'Ivoire and the plan that we have implemented, well, very quickly, we set up our response plan and a plan for economic, social, and humanitarian support. And I believe that the essential thing for all of our countries was to respond very quickly. Around March 2nd, we had our first cases, and in March 23rd, we had 25 cases and a population of 25 million. We responded and set up our response plan, and we ordered all the required equipment, hand sanitizers, face masks, and everything that we needed to protect ourselves. And immediately thereafter, the government implemented its response and support plan. It's an economic, social, and humanitarian response to the tune of $3 billion, which is a sizable amount. It represents 5% of our GDP. And this plan was quickly brought to bear thanks to international solidarity and the support of international institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF and the African Development Bank, as well as bilateral donors. And I thank them all for their support. And as President Macky Sall was saying, we believe more should be done. And this leads me to a comment. For decades, I myself was working for international institutions, and we all insisted that industrial countries devote 0.7% of their GDP to support developing countries. And with this country, we see that all of these countries can devote 5, 6, 7% of their GDP to respond to the pandemic. I believe that there is a lesson to be learned there from this situation, which is to say that there is a certain selfishness which, since for decades, since our independence, developing countries have been requested this 0.7%, but this was never reached. Even the more generous countries only did have 0.35%. But it's not to say that we want to beg. What we are asking for is to have the right conditions at the international level to support us when it comes to overcoming our issues. For Côte d'Ivoire, the first results give us hope. The mortality rate is between 1 and 1.5%, 25 deaths so far, and 53% of positive people tested who are positive, and more than 50% of them have been cured. We have no curfew to date, so we have all of our activities going on, be it school, restaurants, hotels. On all our country, everything is functioning. 100% of the cases today are in Abidjan. Since April 21st, we have had no cases outside or in the hinterland. So we have isolated Abidjan in order to be able to overcome this issue. President Ouattara, one brief question as well. As Côte d'Ivoire, you are one of the defenders or one of the champions for food production, and you want to play a greater role in food production. We have had no issues in terms of food production. Côte d'Ivoire has always been an agricultural country, which is why we quickly close our borders or close the rest of the country from Abidjan to protect our agriculture. That's the most important, and this worked well. We today have had no issue of food insecurity. So there's no regional risk of food security that was forecasted. Well, of course, for the sub-region, we could fear some issues, but we have maintained our closures along the border, be it air, land, and sea. But for goods, for trade, things are still circulating. So we do have the possibility. And we are grateful to our neighboring countries, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. They continue to supply us, and we continue to supply them. So as regards Côte d'Ivoire, no issues there. And for the sub-regions, yes, there are a few concerns. And the continent, of course, experts are there to say this, that the prospects are quite dire indeed. Thank you. So I don't want to go into details, but we do have plans on each of the main topics. A solidarity plan to the tune of $285 billion, a plan to support our major companies for $165 billion, a support plan for the SMEs for $250 billion, and a fund to support the informal sector, because you see, in our country, the informal sector has been the most affected by the closure of small restaurants and markets. And we have a fund for $160 billion and a special fund for the agricultural sector to help them. And this goes back to the question that you raised, because we want to maintain our resiliency of our agricultural sector. So things are going well, and our growth rate before the pandemic was estimated by the Bretton Woods institutions at over 7%, and we believe that we will be between 3 and 4% of growth rate, this despite the pandemic. Thank you, President. We'll come back in a few moments on other topics.
Thank you for your patience. You recently urged African countries to collaborate more to overcome this crisis. So concretely, how can African countries increase information and resource sharing, in your opinion?
Well, first and foremost, I want to take this opportunity to join my colleagues and to thank them all for participating and send my greetings, as well as yourself, Richard, for organizing this forum. But let me begin by saying that it is quite clear to me and to many of my colleagues across the African continent that our success in defeating this particular disease is going to be based both on our individual country responses, but more importantly, on our collective response as a continent, because that ultimately, given the porous nature of our borders, we need each other in order to overcome this particular problem. Let me go further and say that we have had very encouraging dialogue under the chairmanship of Cyril Ramaphosa, who is our current AU chair, where we have been exchanging ideas and possibilities, first and foremost on what we ourselves as a continent can do, and also equally joining together to see how we can get the international community to mobilize support, not necessarily just for individual countries, but for the continent as a whole. As I'm sure you are aware, we ourselves have tried to mobilize the limited resources that we have to develop a joint position. We have put money as Africa to our Africa CDC Center in Addis Ababa. We have also equally contributed towards trying to ensure that we, as a country and as a continent, are able to share the resources that we individually can do, be they PPPs, be they masks. How can we share the limited resources we have, not only within our own populations, but across the African continent? But ultimately, this is a problem that Africa alone will not be able to defeat. I continue to emphasize this is a problem that was not created by Africa, but has the greatest chance of hurting Africa more than any other part of the world. So the international community itself also has an obligation to support this continent of ours in our endeavor to defeat this disease. And we are also appealing that this is not the time for blame game. This is the time to reach, find solutions, find the vaccines, get the economies open. Our countries are today much more than ever before dependent on the global economy, and the continued shutdown has affected many of our diverse industries where our bread and butter as a continent is, be it in Kenya, horticulture, tourism, be it mining in other countries. All these are industries that have hurt us. So we are not only faced with the problem of corona, we are also faced with a severe problem of underdeveloped economies, joblessness, but also the ravages of climate change, and as is happening currently in Kenya, now of severe floods. So let me just say that to win, it must be a partnership. To win, we must change the way we think. To win, we must change our approach to humanity. Richard, that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you. President Bio, thank you for being with us. Your country was one of the most affected by the Ebola epidemic earlier this decade. So this was an occasion, if I can say, for the African continent to learn many lessons. So how are they helping you to deal today with this crisis?
Thank you, Richard. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be part of this discussion. COVID has kept us apart, but through this technology, we are able to see one another and discuss the way forward out of COVID. Definitely, we suffered quite a lot with Ebola, and we were able to learn lessons as a result. And we have used that to bring to bear on the current situation. Before, we did not get any case of COVID in Sierra Leone until March 31st. That is because once we heard about it elsewhere, we took measures to control entrance into Sierra Leone. We didn't close our borders, but we are very vigilant in terms of monitoring everybody that came in. We immediately put in a quarantine system, a whole set of protocols to make sure that those who are coming in had to stay off from mingling with the rest of the public for at least 14 days before we allow them to go out, whether they were Sierra Leoneans or other nationals. So our first defense was actually to prevent any incident of COVID in Sierra Leone, and we did that right around all the ports of entrance into Sierra Leone, and that is how we are able to keep Corona out of Sierra Leone for a very long time. Once we had our index case, our next move was what do we do to make sure it doesn't spread? And if it was going to spread, what would be our best effort to really reduce the speed of its spread as it has happened elsewhere? So from learning again from our past experience with Ebola, we immediately put in place measures to prevent it from moving out of Freetown, that is the capital city, into the other areas. Different measures, most of which have been mentioned by some of my colleagues and known around the world. We put all of those measures into place to reduce the speed. Of course, with different modes of transmission, it has been going around. At the moment, we have tested about 4,000 people, and the average number of tests per day now is between 150 and 170. We have had 534 cases, and we have only 33 deaths at the moment, and we are still putting together. What we did was, from Ebola, all those who had worked in terms of contact tracing, surveillance, we lost quite a lot of our medical doctors during the fight against Ebola. The remainder we were able to bring together, we put together a national structure. And from Ebola, one of the lessons we learned for just like coronavirus, without a vaccine and medication, the best medication is awareness among the population. Everybody knowing that this is the biology of this particular virus and the mode of transmission. Right across the country, everybody should know how to prevent being in touch with contact with anybody who has contracted the virus and how we can stop it spreading. That is the best, that is the only medication in the absence of any correct biomedical intervention at this moment. So social mobilization is a great weapon in addition to other measures. Everybody working to make sure that they don't spread the disease. So the bitter lessons of Ebola has taught us quite a lot of taught us lessons that we were able to bring to bear on the situation. And we still have technical expertise within the country, which we were able to mobilize very quickly. So far, we have been able to really relatively contain the virus. Of course, it is spreading, but our move now is to make sure we slow and break the circuit of transmission and make sure that we get rid of it. Of course, it's a fight for lives and also fight for livelihoods, which is quite difficult, taking into consideration our economic and social situation. So some of the measures that have been used elsewhere, we have been finding difficult to use, and we have been really very circumspect not to use what others have used just because they are being used elsewhere, like complete lockdown, that hard lockdown when nobody comes out. It is not possible here. And what we have done is inter-district, and we have curfew to reduce the time for interaction among huge numbers of people. And so far, we have been relatively successful using the experience we've had and also the expertise. And that is how we've been able actually to control the virus so far.
Thank you, Mr. President. Monsieur le Président Issoufou.
President Issoufou, I would like to come back to you on an important topic. Despite the pandemic and the ceasefire raised by the UN Secretary General, the security risks remain very important on the African continent. How does the pandemic affect, and can you discuss the security situation in Sahel briefly? Is the question to me? Yes, President. So the question is to me, Richard. Yes. Yes, President Issoufou. Thank you very much. Others can respond as well, of course. Richard, allow me, before answering this question on security, to make a comment on the new paradigm that we need to see after this pandemic. Globalization has really done away with distances, so all conditions are there for what we can call the butterfly effect, which is to say small causes that produce large-scale consequences, as proves the current health crisis. COVID reminds us of the fact that we have a common destiny, and this should lead us to think about the implementation of a new paradigm, which supposes a new political and economic governance, more democracy, the acceleration of political and economic integration of the African continent, and stronger democratic institutions capable of promoting good governance in the various countries of the continent. These, I believe, are major issues that should feed our debate at the continental as well as at the global level. This debate should no longer be avoided. We can no longer avoid the issues of reform, for example, of the UN institutions, including those of the Security Council. We can no longer avoid the discussion on the inequities and the need for a new sharing of wealth at the global level and at the level of each country. This debate has kept employed generations of economists, but it's really not a technical discussion, it's more a political one. And there is a US economist, Simon Kuznets, who defended the topic according to which inequities are accentuated during the first phases of industrialization, and that they would spontaneously decrease as development continues. And this was said to us during the Cold War to keep developing countries in the orbit of the West, but actually nothing is spontaneous. Necessarily, we need to organize ourselves to fight against inequity, to conceive and implement the post-COVID-19 paradigm. This new paradigm, to my mind, should be focused not only on the fight against inequities, but also on the climate challenge, because the current model, and President Macky Sall has said this before, is attacking nature, but we have not inherited the earth from our ancestors. No, we're only borrowing it from our children. So the new paradigm should allow Africa to mobilize the necessary financial resources to allow us to overcome poverty. And we need to be brave in our actions. We need to first promote the capacity of African countries to mobilize more domestic resources, more taxation, to reach 24% of GDP. This compared to less than 20% in a lot of African countries today. We also need to promote direct foreign investment. We need to mobilize resources from the African diaspora. And President Ouattara mentioned this. Developed countries need to keep their promises made during the 70s to allow foreign aid to reach 0.7% of GDP, which is quite low if we compare this to the level of funding brought to bear by the United States in the framework of the Marshall Plan to the reconstruction of Europe. It was 4% of the GDP of the United States for 5 years devoted to the reconstruction of Africa. And you can see that compared to 0.7%, the levels of the Marshall Plan were much higher. And President Macky Sall also mentioned this. We need to forgive the debt of the African continent, promoting various values: dignity, freedom, solidarity, equity, fairness. These are the values, I do believe, that should be the basis of the new paradigm. And in order to come back to security, if you allow, and to come back to the question you were raising, we know that the African Union set itself 2020 a goal of a ceasefire for 2020, which was part of our plan, continental plan. And we are aware of the link between security and development. But the health crisis today has socio-economic consequences. Unemployment, increase in poverty, including the people going hungry. So it will have clear consequences in terms of security. But currently, for Sahel at least, this crisis has not had consequences on the development of the military operations carried out by the G5 Sahel, the Barkhane forces, and the National Armed Forces, as well as the MJTF in Sahel, in what we call the northern area along the three borders, and in the Lake Chad Basin. Our defense and security forces are more and more overcoming terrorists. The implementation of the Sahel Coalition to fight terrorism, decided on January 13th by the G5 Sahel and France, will allow us to continue this trend through launching the Takuba operation, which will be made up of the European Special Forces, as well as the launching of the Special Forces of ECOWAS and the African Union. We also hope for the participation of more countries to the Sahel Coalition, which is based around 4 pillars: bolstering the fight against terrorism, building up military capabilities of the G5 Sahel countries, coming back to the areas controlled by terrorists currently, and social and economic development. And Richard, I'm taking advantage of this opportunity to make an appeal to solidarity in favor of Sahel, which will have a triple crisis: security, health, and economic. So there will be real consequences in terms of security, and so we need to continue to face these. Thank you, President. President Macky Sall and President Ouattara. President Macky Sall, can you hear me? Yes, says President Sall. In terms of debt, according to you, what should we do in terms of private commercial debt? And what should we do in terms of public debt? I would like to have your impressions, President Macky Sall, and the same goes to President Ouattara and President Kenyatta.
About what should be done for the public debt and the commercial debt for Africa. Monsieur le Président Macky Sall.
President Macky Sall. Thank you very much, Richard. Before discussing this issue, I want to come back to national considerations and say to you that to date, we have a total number of people who tested positive, 2,617 in Senegal. 1,133 were cured. We have 1,450 who are still under care. We are in a similar situation as other African countries, and we have launched a national social and economic plan with a fund of 1 billion CFA francs to support our social support to households, as well as macroeconomic stability with the support to the business sector and the protection of jobs. We also have strengthened our macroeconomic situation through innovating fiscal measures and injecting liquidity with the support from banks, and we have secured the strategic stocks of country, be it food stocks or oil. We have some concerns in terms of what we will do if the crisis goes on and on. We don't have the self-sufficiency that Côte d'Ivoire has in terms of food. We are large consumers of rice, and we are self-sufficient only for 70% of our consumption. So we need to be prepared to ensure the supply if the crisis were to continue in Asia. Regarding the debt and what was said, I also have to tip my hat to the Monetary Fund and the World Bank, because their response was immediate with the implementation of various mechanisms, including special drawing rights for the countries. This was not enough, and after thanking these institutions for what they have done, we need to continue these efforts in order to ensure a pardon of bilateral debt. This might take some time, but while we wait, we need to keep in mind that the level of bilateral debt for Africa, of sub-Saharan Africa, represents less than 2% of the resources that were mobilized during this pandemic for the G20 countries. So you can see the proportion here, less than 2%. And we need to be innovating in terms of commercial debt, because it's at that level, at the level of private debt, that efforts should be carried out in order to help our countries, in order to ensure that they are capable, of course, to reimburse this debt, but that they have more budgetary space to allow them to continue their health response, which needs to continue. We need to carry out the tests at a larger scale, take care of those who are sick, isolate all these people. And all of this costs a lot. We need equipment, and so I don't need to dwell on this. But we need to be innovating, and the African group is thinking about a mechanism that could be set up, and this could benefit from the support or the guarantee of partner countries, for example, of the European Union, and also the mechanisms of the European Union. And we could also use our special drawing rights in order to give the guarantees to this vehicle, which could buy back the commercial debt and restructure it so that the countries will have longer maturities, debt over 15, 20, 25 years, and this could be reimbursed at much lower rates, 2 to 4%, because this contrary to the rates that we're currently getting with Eurobonds. So that's what we're requesting. We just need more solidarity, and we need a new state of mind, and we need to understand that we can't move ahead in isolation. The virus respects no international border. The virus needs no visa to go to the United States, Europe, or Africa. And on this basis, we have a common destiny, and I am convinced that if we consider the real economy, the economy that allows us to invest more in agriculture, food production, for example, for our planet, in sustainable energy to protect our climate, in healthcare infrastructure to have an appropriate response for our humanity, and devote more to education and training to have a really meaningful development that puts man at its core, and human rights. This is the issue. In terms of debt, contributions can be made, and Africans are resilient. Believe me, Africans are not lazy, contrary to an idea that some might have. Africans work more than others, but they earn much less. They are in the fields, they are in factories, and they are working, but they are unfairly subjected to the consequences of globalization. And we see this in terms of climate. We pollute the less, but we are the most subjected to the consequences of climate change. And it's the same thing economically. Major economies have resources to allow them to overcome this crisis. But what will we do after COVID-19? The consequences will be much more dramatic than the health consequences. What means will we have at hand in order to support our airlines, to support our tourism industry, which is one of the cash cows for countries such as Senegal? Everything is closed and will continue for weeks to come. So we need to invent together mechanisms for more equity that will allow Africa to have room to breathe to face this better. Thank you, President. President Ouattara, do you want to respond to this issue of the debt?
I would like also to get your view on the debt queue, which is a very important one. Monsieur le Président Ouattara.
President Ouattara. Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Of course, the issue of debt. I first want to congratulate myself of the initiative of the African Union and of appointing experts such as my brother Tidiane Ngozi and others who are working on this issue and who have expertise that is world-class. And I believe that their discussions and their efforts will bring to bear solutions. And I come back to say that in terms of international aid, we have here an opportunity with this crisis to have a new starting point, and that countries can easily respect this level of 0.7%. They have shown this by reaching 5-6% of GDP in their response to the pandemic. So we need more solidarity regarding debt, multilateral debt, and I am delighted of the initiatives taken by the powers that be, Kristalina Georgieva, David Matas, and my young brother Akin of the African Development Bank and others, who have mobilized exceptional resources and who are trying to set up specific mechanisms in order to help African countries, amongst others. But of course, we have the issue of private debt, commercial debt, and this debt needs to be dealt with expeditiously. We have to borrow on international markets, and our interest rates, to our mind, are too high. Côte d'Ivoire has excellent macroeconomic criteria, much better than many European countries. But when we go to international markets, we have to borrow at 6%. But in Europe, these countries borrow at 1.5% or less even. So there needs to be more recognition of our stability and of the security in our countries, which is why personally I am mindful of our economic framework. And in Côte d'Ivoire, we have a very solid and stable economic framework, which has sizable initiatives. After this crisis, we will reach growth rates of 8-9% for the decade to come. So I wanted to insist that more efforts need to be made. These are important issues in terms of commercial debt, and I have full trust in the expert group set up by the African Union to help find us solutions with our creditors.
President Kenyatta, what is your personal opinion on the debt issue, which is a crucial one?
Thank you very much. First and foremost, I just want to join President Macky Sall by thanking the Bretton Woods institutions, especially the IMF and the World Bank, for the very quick manner in which they responded to this disaster, acted and intervened on behalf of many African countries and many of the less developed countries across the world. But let me also say that we also need to be able to get a proper understanding, because I believe there is a huge misconception about this issue of debt. Africa has taken on this debt, and the debt that we have, be it public or commercial, with the primary purpose of developing weak infrastructure, from health to roads to power, in order to be able to create sustainable economies, economies that can create jobs for our young men and women. And I believe, and it can be laid to witness that as a result of a lot of this kind of investment, we have seen the growth patterns in Africa increase from very, very, very low 1-2 percentage points to many, and the largest number of countries that were recording the highest, among the highest economic growth rates in the globe, were found here on the African continent as a result of that investment. Now here we are, made the investment. We are now faced with challenges that are global challenges, that are really not African made, that have now resulted in our economies beginning once again to stagnate. And what we're saying is that this is an opportunity for the international community to be able to understand the continent and to be able to say, well, how can we be of assistance to these countries that are struggling to create not only growth, but also create employment and create social impact in terms of health, education, and other areas. And the only way to do so is to help us. As we were growing, we were able to sustain and to pay our debts. Now, with the shrinkage that has occurred in tourism and in all many other sectors, from the commodities that we export, the oil, the coffee, the tea, the cocoa, the other industries that we have been involved in, we were able to pay, and we were paying regularly. But now we have been hit by something, like I said, has not come out of the African continent, but has come from the outside. We now need fiscal space, not only to protect the health of our people, but to also ensure that those who have lost jobs are able to have a social safety net. This is the time for the world to come in and say, let us give Africa this space. Help them, give them enough opportunity to create the fiscal space in order to meet the social needs. And once we are again back on our feet, we shall be able to once again move forward. So in line with the theme of this meeting, I believe that this is the time that the world needs to look at each other in very different circumstances. We are not begging this time. We are saying, give us the necessary fiscal space in order for us to be able to cater for our people, in order for us to be able to sustain our economies, in order for us to be part of the global community. This is not a handout. This is support based on a crisis that was not created on the African continent. So I believe that this is the opportunity for the world to come to the fore and show that they and us can be partners for the future of humanity.
Thank you, President Kenyatta. President Pio, are you aligned with what your peers just said?
Sure, definitely. Africa has always been at the receiving end of most of what happens around the world. We have been making progress, as my colleague just said, and that progress again has been disrupted by COVID. We don't have the quantum of money to create the sort of economic packages, economic stimulus packages that are being bandied around the world. At least if we can be given the opportunity to stay, not to pay off on these debts, or if we can, I think, really be radical, talk about the cancellation of this debt, I think that would be a great service. And it will actually show that we are committed to making sure that the world, there is inclusion, that what we've been talking about for everybody, that Africa also is included in the process of developing. We don't want to be at the receiving end. And again, we have had to, we are dealing with COVID, and it's definitely going to have a great impact on our economies, weak as they are, but we have been making some effort. So I am totally aligned with the views expressed by my colleagues. And I think that is what we have to do if the world is to show solidarity with Africa in this fight against COVID, and the sort of resilience we need to build in our systems if we are going to make progress and restart our economies immediately after COVID.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before we go to our conclusion, I would like just to share with you a very short video. We asked some young people, as you know, Africa is about our young people, and they want to have a voice, and they have, I think, some highlights, some questions that they would like to address. So I would like to share with you what some African young talent just told us a few days ago. Please, let's watch together this short video.
In most African countries, businesses, startups, and small businesses owned by young people has been closed down. And to continue to work, they will need a capital. So how are the government going to ensure that the financial system are supporting and easing the access of funds to those businesses?
With schools around the continent now closed, many children and their families, especially those in disadvantaged communities, are in a difficult situation. How will you ensure, or how are you ensuring that all children continue to have access to education and learning?
We have seen many digital initiatives by Senegalese young people for distribution, for information campaigns, as well as online testing. How did you assess this support from the population, and do you believe that one day we can be integrated in terms of our response to pandemics or major risks for our country? So time is of the essence, but we need to answer one important question: education.
So I hope you will get the sound from me. Là, apparemment, le son arrive. Thank you. C'est malheureusement.
We are having sound issues, and this allows me. This is why I hope that we will have physical meetings rather than virtual ones.
The physical event will be back soon, because this world of virtual is okay, but I don't think this is our destiny. So anyway, how do you react?
How do you react in terms of education? Africa needs to be even more connected. We don't all have computers in rural areas.
How do you deal with online education in this current time? Who wants to answer? Qui veut répondre?
Who wants to answer first to this issue of education? President Macky Sall. Thank you, Richard. Education is a cross-cutting issue which is fundamental for our society's development. In Senegal, we have considered that we need a change in paradigm in terms of education. And we have oriented our students much more towards scientific training and technical training, but also towards professional training, because the world has changed around us, and Africa needs to be able to be better connected and integrated to the global economy. New technologies will have to be present in our daily lives. So in Senegal, we have roughly 75% of high school students that are studying literature. And starting in primary school, we are trying to create vocational approaches, as well as in middle school and high school, in order to reach 50% at least of our high schoolers who are studying sciences and 50% literature, before promoting even more scientific and technical education. Because the development of these startups, the young woman from Rwanda in the video clip was discussing this, and all of these new technologies and this new global orientation towards the Internet of Things, we will have to have people trained in school and capable to be fully cognizant of what we need in the global world. In terms of startups, we have created a delegation to create entrepreneurship for young people and women, which currently receives a grant of 50 billion CFA francs. And thanks to the support of the African Development Bank, and I thank them in their support in this pandemic, as well as the Islamic Bank and all the partners. And thank to their action, the African Development Bank, today we had more than $200 million roughly that we could contribute to the financing of startups, the financing of women's empowerment, without requesting any guarantees that the young people do not have. And projects such as these will allow us to support this innovation for African youth, which is a youth that is innovating and has shown its entrepreneurship, but they need the support of this country, because conventional banks do not finance projects without guarantees. So we need partnerships, public-private partnerships, and the support of state. But education needs to be at the basis of our efforts. And I will stop there and let my colleagues intervene. President Issoufou. President Issoufou, you have the floor. Is it me? Yes, you have the floor, President Issoufou. Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Before answering your question on education, I want to remind you that in Niger as well, we have set up, and faced with the health crisis, a response plan to the tune of $2.2 billion, which foresees fiscal measures to support SMEs, as well as a support plan for vulnerable population. And for the time being, Niger has had 9 cases, and we have had 75 people who died, and we are trying to contain the pandemic, and we are succeeding with the social distancing measures that we have set up. Regarding youth, our continent, as you know, is characterized by its demographic structure with a very young population. The median age of our population is 19, and this youth of the population is both an asset and a major challenge. It will only become an asset when we will be capable to transform this demographic asset. And we need to educate, take care of our young people. And in the framework of our program that we are setting up in Niger, our ambition is to increase the percentage of young people towards science and to reach 40%. Since we need to keep in mind that in emerging and developing countries, this ratio is 60%. It was 8% only in Niger in 2011, and we will reach 40% by 2021, which will allow us to improve how employable young people will be. Generally speaking, in Africa, in the job market, we have to make a space for 10 million young people every year. And these may be 30 million in 2040 or 2050. And we need to create jobs, find jobs for all of this youth that is arriving on the job market. So we need to implement the 2063 agenda in the programs that favor integration. And as a consequence, we need to allow to create employment that is requested for our youth. So we need to accelerate after COVID the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which should have been implemented in June, but unfortunately COVID has forced us to postpone the calendar. We are thinking about the new timeline, but outside of this continental free trade area, there are other plans of the 2063 agenda on which we need to insist. The plan for infrastructure in Africa. Africa needs railroads, Africa needs energy, Africa needs airport, port infrastructure, etc. And all of this will create jobs. We need to develop our industry because Africa should not continue to be merely an exporter of raw goods. As long as we continue to do this, we will not create enough jobs for our youth. We need to transform raw goods, have processing to create jobs for these young people who will arrive in their millions on the job market. We also should further develop agriculture. We are importing $50 billion of grain every year for Africa. We have the highest percentage of agricultural land in the world. So we need to insist on agricultural development. So Africa has many assets. And after COVID, we will have to accelerate this integration, and the solution to the problems for our youth today can be found in integration. Thank you, President. President Ouattara, if you will allow me, I fully agree with what my predecessors have just said, and I want to insist to say to our youth that they need to continue to keep hope. I believe that this pandemic has shown clearly that the strategy that my administration is carrying out is the right one, to insist on education and healthcare. I don't want to come back on all of the details of what we have done in Côte d'Ivoire recently, but we have done as much as the 50 years preceding our administration. And in terms of healthcare, this pandemic leads us to increase the share of our expenditure, our spending in health, and to improve healthcare infrastructure during the Ebola crisis. Even though we had neighboring countries such as Guinea and Nigeria, we didn't have a single case of Ebola in Côte d'Ivoire. Given the current evolution of the COVID pandemic, it also shows that the healthcare system is quite resilient. And I consider that this remains a priority. In terms of education, I fully agree with my colleague, President Macky Sall, that technical and technological training is the best approach. When I see all the startups that the young people are trying to create, and all of this was interrupted because of this pandemic, because of the curfew and social distancing, the difficulty of finding financing, all of this has affected our youth. Particularly in Côte d'Ivoire, we see that tourism and restaurants are a source of employment for young people who have therefore been greatly affected by this crisis. So this reminds us that we need to continue training our young people, give them technical training. And we have had a new laid down new cables thanks to technology that is homegrown and allowed to develop this. And education is our better investment. Our youth is our treasure, and we have to work to improve the conditions for young people. This, of course, should lead to finding them jobs, which requires a good economic policy and investments. It means that governments need to be able to find the right projects and to ensure that issues of governance receive the utmost priority, because it's by improving governance that we will improve investments and that we will create jobs for young people.
Merci,
thank you.
President Kenyatta, you wanted to react on this education or other questions asked by the youth.
Thank you very much. And if you will allow me, I just want to go back to the previous subject that we were discussing, because indeed, as we are talking about this new world order, I also wanted just to say that I'd like to take this opportunity to thank those of the developed countries, especially President Macron, who has been in the forefront of saying that there is a need for this new world order, of saying that there is a need to support the most vulnerable nations, and I just wanted that point to come across. Secondly, to say that in Kenya, technology has played a huge role in changing the way we do things. Mobile money, mobile telephony has really changed the way in which Kenyans have transacted with each other, especially over the last 10 years. And as a result of that, a few years ago, we ourselves began the process of changing our curriculum to a much more competence-based curriculum, a competence-based curriculum that arms our young people with the skills that they require to face the challenges and the job market of the 21st century. And that's why when you hear of a lot of these young people who are doing deliveries, others, we in Kenya, for example, are using the mobile telephone system to distribute funds to the most vulnerable in our community. Virtually every single individual has a phone. It is creating greater transparency. And we are also seeing very many startups, because we must also look at it from that perspective. As a result also of the lockdowns that we have had, we have seen very many new startups that have come up using technology, using the internet to provide goods and services to people who have been locked in rooms. So it has also created opportunities and shown the great possibilities that exist, especially for our young people, through the use of technology with the right training, to create opportunities not only for employment, but also for growth of our economies in the so-called fourth industrial revolution. And I would just but encourage and say that I am very keen to work in partnership with these great young people who, as everybody who is participating today, my fellow colleagues have acknowledged, they actually are not the future of our continent. They are the present. They are the majority. They are the ones who are there today. And mine is to say, let us work together in solidarity. Let us push our economies forward. Let us create these new opportunities. Let us forge together and make this continent, this youthful continent, the continent of tomorrow.
Thank you, President Kenyatta. My question to all of you as a conclusion, and I will start with President Issoufou. If you have in one sentence an advice to give to the G20 countries, what will be this advice? Please, Monsieur le Président Issoufou.
President Issoufou, what advice would you give to the G20, which is meeting in a few months in Riyadh? Thank you, Richard. In a few words, what I could say is that there will be before COVID-19 and after COVID-19. It is extremely important for the world to think about a new paradigm. This new paradigm should be based on certain values: solidarity, equity, freedom, and dignity. This is extremely important. As I was saying before, it is important that we find resources. There are many resources in the world, but they need to be better shared inside of countries and among countries. And therefore, we need to move things along and create the right conditions in order to be able to implement this new paradigm.
President Bio, if you have an advice to give to the G20 countries, the G20 group, which will meet soon, the world leaders, what will be this advice, Mr. President?
I think we have to be frank with Africa and support Africa to go through this particular pandemic in a way that we can resume normal activities again. But quite apart from this, I couldn't use my time to talk about education. If you can just give me 1 minute, I should be able to do so. We consider human capital development as very important for our development as a nation. And the best way you can develop the human being is by education, investment in education. And that investment must be fit for purpose. As the fourth industrial revolution is looming, that education has to be fit for purpose. So what type of education do we give to our youth, especially taking into consideration the youth bulge, so that they are not a problem or a challenge in the future? It means that we have to educate them in a way that we can lead the fourth industrial revolution. We should not be at the receiving end. So even with all what is happening, what we have done is to make sure that using radio, television, the current technologies that are here, we are using everything to make sure that we can deliver education to all the remote areas in the country that we can reach. So Africa should endeavor to make sure that every effort is made to give quality education, especially with the prediction that we are going to have a very high population in Africa. We should make sure that that population is fit for purpose by making sure that we invest in education, that we place them ahead of the queue, so that we are not just consumers, but also Africa should be able to lead and take part in the fourth industrial revolution in a meaningful way. Thank you.
President Kenyatta, your message that you shared on stage in Riyadh last October still resonates in my mind. What will be your next message to our friend who will meet soon in Riyadh from the G20?
To our friends in the G20, I have one very simple message. Africa is not the problem, but through partnership, we can be part of the solution. Period.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you.
President Macky Sall, what messages would you share with the leaders of the G20, and you take part in these meetings quite regularly? Thank you very much. Well, this would be a message of hope a message of partnership. We can consider that economy and finance are not an end in and of themselves, that they're just a means to finding a solution, to improving the well-being of mankind, which is why we're making this appeal to a new world order that places mankind at its core. The G20 does have the means to support us. We have said this before. We're not begging here. We need to have the right mechanisms that will allow us all together to overcome our difficulties. And this is the message that I would share with my friends from the G20. President Ouattara, you have the last word. What advice or what comments would you make before a G20 in November, and what conclusions would you give? Thank you. I want to say that we have a common position of the African Union, as expressed by our brothers who represent us at that level, and we are in full solidarity. And I believe that the key word, as President Uhuru Kenyatta was saying, is solidarity and partnership. And Africa is the continent of the future, and I believe that some are understanding this. Everyone needs to realize this, and which is why it is good to have this partnership to continue forging ahead, and so that the world can become a place where we can all live in peace, but also in security. And to conclude, I would like to thank you, my dear friend Richard Atias, for having organized this video conference on behalf of my brothers. Since I am the eldest in age, the age in Africa is important. I would like to, on behalf of all of us, tell you that we are grateful for this opportunity to discuss together, and thank my brothers for the exchanges that we have had, which were extremely fruitful. I believe that Africa has drawn the lessons of this pandemic. I believe that this opens opportunities for us to insist on health, and we do this already, but we need to continue because we now have the support of the international community. We need to continue to place health as well as education and technical training for our youth at the core of our activities, to ensure that young people keep hope and remain in Africa, in their own continent, to help to develop their countries. And I believe that the situation with COVID is quite difficult for the world. It is difficult in Africa, of course, due to the weaknesses of our healthcare systems, but we nonetheless have very low mortality rates, and we have a lot of people who get better, maybe because we have all taken anti-malarial drugs when we were young, or because our population is quite young compared to other countries. But that is not enough. We need to encourage our scientists and our experts to find drugs and homegrown solutions adapted to our future life in case there were future pandemics. We never know, other pandemics could happen, so that in the continent we have human resources, our own human resources, to overcome these difficulties. I'm very proud of the medical experts in Côte d'Ivoire and in many African countries, because the medical sector has confronted full on the issue and has worked tirelessly, and the results have been quite good. Of course, we all want to overcome this pandemic, and we have not done what the Europeans have done, or what has been done in the United States. If we avoided quarantine, in most cases it's because it's contrary to our culture. We live in society, and we have adapted our fight against the pandemic to our own culture, and we have had curfews from time to time. We have tried to separate various regions from the other, but we have not separated human beings while supporting social distancing and putting in place the right measures. This was important to overcome this issue of COVID. I would like to conclude by thanking Richard for your staff and your experts that allowed us to have this discussion, because without them it would not have been possible. And we hope that despite the fact that this was fruitful, what we are hoping is to see you personally in Côte d'Ivoire. And I'm sure this is true for the other countries as well. And I hope our countries will continue in good health, and I wish them good prospects for the future. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, President Ouattara. You said a word that is very important that I will come back to for the last transition. You spoke about culture, President, and I believe that despite this crisis, I believe that it is important
et de rendre hommage à notre culture africaine.
To continue to support our African culture. So the words of conclusion will be given to a daughter of our continent who is a goodwill ambassador with UNICEF, our sister, Angélique Kidjo.
I would like to highlight the African culture, and I will give the floor to our sister, the goodwill ambassador of UNICEF, Angélique Kidjo. Merci à vous. Thank you very much, Your Excellencies. Merci à tous. Angélique, the floor is yours. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Hello, everyone. Thank you, my dear Richard, for inviting me to this virtual conversation. The COVID-19 pandemic is a challenge to our humanity, our solidarity, and our resilience. We need to take this moment to think about what we want for the future of my beloved continent, Africa. I think this is the moment where we should reinvent the idea of Pan-Africanism. We've seen today with this pandemic that people's health is at the center of the well-being of our economy. Financial gain cannot be more important than the health of all the human beings on this planet. So for that, I have a song that I want to sing for you that celebrates our Africanity, our humanity, our solidarity, and it's called Africa. Baby fond Africa grelo, me wena fond bo monde ekbeton mi de souciant la me wede, me de manali dat be mi ton, ye fond bodo nyanya ton we, Africa me bi se ton we, mi no mi be nyanya ton rido, ashe mama Africa, mama Africa, ashe mama Africa, mama Africa, ashe mama Africa, mama me de le chimbo jijani ba me de le fondo nu wa we you not gonna to we glelo ye ma do no de wa we ni yo ye fondo nyanya ton we Africa me bi se ton we mi no mi gbe nyanya ton ri do ashe mama Africa, mama Africa, ashe mama oh mama Africa, ashe mama Africa, mama Africa, ashe mama Africa. Ni show, 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 ni show. Ni show, ni show, ni show. Maybe fond Africa grelo, me wena fond bo monde ekbeton, mi de souciant la me wede, me de manali dat be mi ton, ye fond bodo nyanya ton we, Africa maybe se ton we, mi no mi be nyanya ton idol, she mama Africa, mama Africa, she mama, oh she mama Africa. She mama Africa.
Makamboe, unu para kileba juliba.